Hey all, welcome to Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism. We have with us today Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we are going to shift gears in our talks about religion and discuss humanism. So, grab your English tea or your chai latte with almond milk and join us as we discuss a fast growing secular philosophy on how we can all get along. This is episode 19 Humanism. And now we get to jump straight into it. So our topic this week is humanism, which you'd think that for a couple of skeptics, we'd have a lot to say about it. However, I think I know more about multiple other religions than I actually do about humanism. So I'm going to let you two gentlemen kind of start, but what are your guys' knowledge or what do you know about humanism?
Well, I just wanted to know, sort of, do either of you identify as humanists? Because I know I do, but I don't actually know about that for you two.
I don't. To be honest, I know very little about it. And when I have tried to look at it, I've seen different definitions of it. My only experience of it is wanting to punch a humanist in the nose one time because he got really angry, which really annoyed me. Like, seriously angry and aggressive towards someone who was religious.
It's one of the core tenets of humanism, isn't it?
For seemingly no reason other than the fact that they were religious, and it was kind of attacking the person, not the idea. And I felt the need to.
Go ahead. You can finish your sentence.
Now, I just felt the need to I wanted to stand in, so I kind of stood in and asked him to back off, and he backed off, fortunately. So no punching in the nose.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to say, it just kind of goes to show that, like, it really doesn't matter what the philosophy is that a person adopts. People are still people, and you're going to find assholes, like, in every walk of life.
Yeah,
like,
a knobhead's still a knobhead, whatever label they give themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have heard, I think it was, I may get this wrong, but I'm sure I once heard Matt Dillahunty say that his experience of humanists in the US was different to his experience of humanists in the UK. And the humanists in the US tend to be like more charitable and outgoing and things like that, whereas the humanists in the UK tended to be more militant. I'm paraphrasing.
I think humanism is quite is a label which is just really not widespread in the UK in the way that it potentially is, from my understanding, as much in the US. And that's, I think, a lot of the, if you turn on the TV and happens to be a humanist representative on some panel of something or whatever, you do tend to get the very intellectual, university educated, smarmy sort of in your face kind of, I'm better than you humanist. But for me, it's kind of like, I mean, I may offend some people by saying this, but like, I think most non-religious people probably are kind of, at least in most ways, humanist, whether or not they sort of identify with that label. And I'm not speaking for you two, but like, in terms of my understanding of humanism and the label for me and what that means, I think does apply to most, sort of skeptical.
So let's get into that for a second then, like what humanists or humanism actually means. Because I've also heard, in addition to the non-religious or secular humanists, I've heard of religious humanists.
Yeah, which is an interesting idea I don't know much about.
It's a bit of a dichotomy. Yeah, I wonder like how much cognitive dissonance goes into something like that, or how they justify it or work it out in their heads. But maybe figuring out exactly what we know about what humanism is might be a good place to start. Just so that the audience has somewhere to go from. Bearing in mind that all of us just admitted that we don't really know what it is. Well, I mean, I have an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us will probably have at least some pieces of the puzzle and stuff. But from my understanding, and in terms of, obviously I say that I identify as a humanist, what that means for me, and I'm probably going to make a right ash of this, but like what that means for me is that science to me is generally the best way of understanding most things in the world, in the universe. It means that I don't take ideas about what's morally good or bad, what the decisions are right or wrong based on authority or on religious texts, but on the well-being of either me as a human or other human beings as well. I try and think rationally about decisions and rationally about sort of my beliefs and understandings about the world around me. What else is there? There's more stuff. Oh, bloody hell. I told you I'd make an ash of it.
But you're kind of describing
but
what some of your beliefs are as someone who says they're a humanist. That's helpful.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously it's a generally speaking a non-religious worldview, so humanists don't have beliefs in gods on the whole. Although, like you said, there are some religious humanists, but I don't really understand that. And humanists generally believe that we just have one life, and there's no afterlife, life after death, heaven, hell, all that malarkey. It's just the one life we know we've got. So to make the best of that, to make the most positive difference to humanity as we can, I guess.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And so that kind of illustrates the extent of the knowledge that I have over humanism, right? Is really just it's a worldview that puts human beings, like the thriving and flourishing and well-being of human beings at like the sort of the forefront of the philosophy. And so I did accidentally label myself as humanist once or twice when I was first getting into the atheist realm. And excuse me. And I was discovering new labels and figuring out what was what. And I was adamant against like labeling myself as anything after picking two different religions. And
I can understand that to me seems quite a natural reaction.
Yeah, like I'm gonna be a nothing from now on. Yeah. And then when I labeled myself as humanist was when I was just starting to get out of that, like, well, I do need to have a community I belong to, and I do need to associate myself with a belief system. Like, hey, this is just for my own clarity purposes and for other people's clarity. Like, oh, this is what I am. This is what I believe. And what stopped me from using it and why I drew back is because I realized I knew so little about it. So I heard pretty much the same thing you said. It's putting human flourishing first. And then I had a philosophy nerd friend of mine point out some of the flaws of humanism and how they can focus on, say, for example, human flourishing above things like the environment or animals' pain and suffering.
And I know there's this idea of, and I think it needs a brand management team on it, but like sentientism, in terms of like human flourishing, but all sentient beings and stuff. I think for me, one of the important aspects of humanism is that like I do feel like I need to have some sort of, like when I was a Christian, I really strongly identified with that. And then when I became an atheist, I strongly identified with that. But atheist is a negative term, isn't it? It's a lack of theism. And it only describes someone on that one specific thought and that idea about whether or not they've got a God belief. And so for me, humanism is a positive label. It's not the things that I don't believe or don't have. It's a list of things that I do believe in and value and sort of really stand by. So but yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think there are legitimate sort of questions to be asked about it, and maybe there does need to be a better replacement. Humanism has its origins like hundreds of years ago, and so it's something that's then continued and developed and grown from there. But yeah, I think I'm not. I think it's a good description of where I am in terms of the sort of broad statements that I said before. But I'm not necessarily precious about it. And if there ends up being something which I find does, describe me more accurately, all the better for it.
I like that in the sense that it gives people sort of a broad general idea of what your values and morals are without having to like have a huge long 3-hour conversation about individual beliefs. But like for me, I didn't even really like accepting the label atheist at first. And then I realized, well, if you do believe in God and you're a theist and you don't believe in a God or aren't convinced of a God and you're an atheist, then I'm an atheist. So it's kind of like labeling myself American or female or whatever. Like it's kind of those are definitionally, it's not a label I can really avoid. But humanist,
do you think
for me,
that the atheist you not wanting to associate with that term came from negative connotations to do with that term?
No, it came from negative connotations of labeling myself as a specific religion, right?
Yeah.
So I was so burned out of like having to defend beliefs of others who are the same religion or bad religious ideas, and I was so burnt out on because you label yourself as this, you're associated as that. And when I would have a challenge or not agree with something, it's like, well, that's not Christian, right? Oh, you don't believe that the Bible is this? Well, then you're not really a Christian. And then the other thing was the shame of leaving the religion. Like, oh, like I called myself a Christian and I called myself a Muslim and I guess I'm not, right? And so then there was like this shame of like, now I have to take back that label and wipe it off and scrub
Even just
myself.
coming out to people, not even if, you know, like there are people probably in my life who still believe I'm a Christian just because I haven't happened to had that much to do with them in order to, you know, inform them of the opposite and stuff. It's yeah.
And that's why I hesitate for the humanist label, especially not understanding it. Like I know a tiny bit about Buddhist philosophy and I like some of what I know, but I wouldn't want to call myself Buddhist, right? And I know a little bit about humanist philosophy, like just enough to have what's appealing about it, but not enough to really call myself that. But my fear is that if I label myself as anything and then learn more and more and more about it, or the community grows and the beliefs become either more solidified where it has to be this, like a tenets, like here's our 5 tenets, you know, or something like that. At what point do me and that belief system start to diverge? So yeah, that's where with humanism, I haven't even deliberately like delved much into it, almost out of like petulance. Like I don't want to learn anything about it because I'll start labeling myself, I'll get all excited and then I'll walk away from it, you know.
Gilliver, in terms of the stuff that I described as my sort of brief outline of the main bits of why I call myself a humanist and stuff, what are your thoughts on those sorts of, because they're not tenets, they're not like rules, it's not like a set you know idea, it's kind of like a big broad hat. But what are your thoughts?
I was going to ask you about whether you considered that there was any tenets involved with it.
Well, we got like the humanist manifestos and stuff where people have tried to sort of write down, but more as an explanation of this is the sort of thing that we believe in or stand for, rather than like in order to call yourself a humanist you must abide by, you know, it's not like a top-down sort of authoritarian regime.
I think what you said sounded pretty much in line with what I've heard other people describe humanism to be. Like Laura, it's not a label. I'm not one for labels. I don't particularly like labels, and I mean the only label I would apply to myself is a skeptic. I think because it is kind of that skeptical way of thinking and trying to work through things.
For sure.
I think definitional labels are fine. Like what I was saying earlier, if this label is defined this way and that meets you or matches you, then that's what you are.
Yeah, I was just going to come on to that because I do use like terms. I don't tend to use humanist. It's very rare I use humanist. I tend to use atheist more, although it's not a label I kind of apply to myself. I realize that in some of the conversations that I have, it's necessary to use that label to show that particular aspect on that question. And so I do agree that sometimes labels are necessary to apply to yourself, but it's like, what do you apply to yourself? What do I call? What's this? I have a question. I'm going to go on a tangent now. I've been trying to be quiet because I did nothing but talk in last week's episode. So
and we're still recovering from that, by the way.
But that's why I was half an hour late.
I get this thing with and you two may have assumed, but you two have had it as well, where kind of when you're talking to quite enthusiastic religious people, theistic people, they're trying to, sometimes they put on the thing that, well, your atheist worldview.
Right.
And I don't have an atheist worldview. I don't think I have any worldview. The things I think are constantly changing.
They're fluid,
updating.
Yeah, mine too.
What I think I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly setting things aside which I've been erroneous on, taking new things on board which I think are more applicable.
And even always reprioritizing things, you know, this is more important to me, this is less important to me, and that changes all the time as well.
Yeah. So, and I don't have a worldview. It's like, what is Richard? What do you call Richard? I mean, do you define me as an atheist? Do you define me as a bass guitarist? Do you define me as a martial artist? Am I in a conglomerate of all those things? You know, and labels just aren't my thing at all. They just frustrate me.
So it sounds to me, based on what we've been saying, that we need to do a skeptic hangout on labels. and like
Yeah.
soon. Maybe the next time we record, because it sounds like we have a lot to say on it. I think it's a very relevant topic, because no matter which, when we're talking about some of these headings, when they apply to people versus ideas, such as Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, like humanism, that kind of stuff, those are all labels. And
But
we
there's a
have
difference, isn't there, between Christianity and a Christian here. There's a difference
exactly,
between humanism
yeah,
and a humanist.
Yeah.
Because like those big ideas are sort of like really big hoops in which you can put people, but the people inside those big hoops are like, I don't know, they're their own thing, aren't they? And they'll get this bit from here and that bit from there. This is a really loose metaphor and it's not really working, so I'm going to move on. But I think what you were saying, Gilliver, before was really interesting in terms of, and I know we're not making this an episode about labels, but like the word humanist for me as a label, I find incredibly useful and actually describes a lot about my worldview in terms of how we should find out information, how we should value things and not value things, and all of those sorts of things. But I think it's not all encompassing either. Like it only describes one aspect of who I am, and it's useful for a specific purpose. Like in a similar way to you said about atheists, like if I'm talking to someone about my beliefs about the world, I'll use that word to describe myself. But I think it's, for that specific sort of area of my life and my outlook,
So that's
as everything I am.
so that's where I would agree with you with the humanist label as being useful within my belief system, or my like, I hate like Gilliver, I have a hard time saying worldview, but my current understanding of the world is like that's where I have used it. That's where I have I know. But like Gilliver said, with it constantly being fluid, right? Like that's one of the reasons why I don't like having a label like humanist. But that's also a reason why I've used it before in the past, like somewhat erroneously without fully understanding it. Is like I'm an atheist humanist, but what I mean is I'm not just someone who doesn't believe in God, but I'm someone who wants to take an active part in trying to make the world a better place. Like, and I know that's very subjective, but in the best capacity that I know how.
Christian, if you describe someone as a Christian,
Yeah.
it tells you that, and I did this in one of my videos, I think early on my channel, but like if you describe someone as a Christian, it tells you that they've got a God belief, but it also tells you, generally speaking, that they probably have a belief that Jesus came to save us from our sins. They probably want to do good work to help people who are needy. They probably, care about, I don't know, there's like a big list of stuff that probably if someone describes themselves as a Christian, it's the God belief and all the other stuff that comes with it, isn't it? And I think when you move away from that, you don't have the God belief, but I don't know, I certainly felt a need to think, well, what do I have?
Yeah.
Do you think humanism as a label or as an idea or a movement or whatever is necessarily in kind of, I don't want to use the word conflict, but is antithesis to religion? Because it's that in I think virtually every time I've encountered it, whether it's an individual or a group, it's been in opposition. That's a good word, opposition. Why didn't we
There
just
we
use
go.
that? Every time I've encountered it, it's always been in opposition to kind of some religious idea or individual or group. I don't think I've ever encountered it as an entity on its own, separate from that. Do you think that it kind of relies, or its necessary existence is in relation to religion, or do you think it can be its own entity?
From my perspective, I think it certainly can be, but it exists in a world where religion plays a part in so many aspects of society and civic life and what have you. We've talked before about how, like in the UK, there's an established church. Well, humanists disagree with that fundamentally because at its core, it's a secular sort of ideology and philosophy and what have you. Those are probably not accurate words to use. But so like, I know humanist organizations in the UK, like Humanist UK, actively stand up for secular ideals in society, in government, in all those sorts of things. So I think you do see it in its most public form as an oppositional force against non-secular or religious ideas or things that people perceive as being damaging to sort of fairness and equality, because obviously if there are religious things that are put in place or things which are deemed unfair in terms of like bishops in the House of Lords, or whether it's certain things being allowed or not allowed to be taught in schools and what have you, like the humanist ideal of like that fairness and equality and secularism is at the heart of it all. So yeah, it kind of does stand in opposition to it, but I don't think that individual humanists necessarily always do, because they're just getting on with their lives, aren't they, most of the time? So
yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it's a whole sociological web, right? And so we develop these groups out of our belief systems, and I wonder, like, if we were to eliminate religion or any sort of, I'll put it this way, like eliminate any sort of supernatural beliefs or any sort of God claims, you're still going to have groups of people that come up with ideologies and belief systems and then group around them. So it's sort of like, it's really, really hard to answer that question in the sense that like we live in a reality where religions dominate the world. Like Gil said, but hypothetically, in a world where religions don't even exist, ideologies would still develop if we're still human, if our minds still work the way that our minds work. It's almost, I can't even see how we could live in a world where that doesn't happen. So I kind of think that humanism arises more or less from a desire for us to know what's right and what's wrong and where we fit into the social scheme of things and where we fit in universally, right? Like what are we here for? Where are we going? Where do we come from? That kind of thing.
yeah.
And I think humanism does that, and it could do that with or without religion. But the reason it opposes religion so much is because, like, at its core, there are some belief systems in religion that just they go so fundamentally against the core systems of humanism. You almost have to have that opposition.
Yeah, and I think secularism is obviously like a core part of humanism, and secularism at its core is all about fairness and justice, and has no problem with people being religious,
right?
You know, and certainly as a humanist, I would, you know, argue massively incredibly strongly in favor of people having the freedom to believe what they want to believe, and you know, it, because what does it matter to me? But when it matters is when it does affect things like, and I know in our next episode we're talking about creationism, for example, but you know, if a school is wanting to ban the teaching of evolution and Big Bang cosmology in favor of creationism, that is a problem, because it doesn't give people the option to not have just the religious view forced upon them. And so actually, yeah, like I say, people like Humanist UK in the UK actively fight against it, and a sort of a force for that sort of goal as a really active sort of group in that way. But yeah, I think the thing about, you were saying, if we lived in a world without those religious groups, humanism, I guess, would it just cease to be a thing? Like, would it just be, this is what people are like? I don't know.
Or would it be more of a base system? Like, you know how we have these Abrahamic faiths as these giant base systems, but we also have like myriad Eastern religions that over the thousands of years of our history have also been like these sort of base systems for other belief systems. I'm curious if humanism, being so simple, right, being so focused on, well, what causes thriving, what is moral, you know, what reduces harm to other humans, and promotes well-being, those things are kind of fundamental across the human experience.
And obviously there are certainly an incredibly vast number of ways to answer all of those questions as well. It's not like humanism is the answer to those questions. It just makes people try to work out the answers rationally and fairly, and not relying on religious authority or holy books or any of those sorts of things.
And it's when we come to those solid conclusions that we get those really strong ideologies, where humanism, I can see it going that way as people start building these communities and they start solidifying things. And you have all these official organizations. That's where I can start to see like the base concept of the philosophical humanism start to take on like new forms. That's where I'm nervous about adopting a label like that, is when it starts to take on like, well, this type of humanist believes only these things, and this is the path to good and to thriving. And these humanisms over here, or humanists over here, think that this is the path to thriving and this is the moral way. And that's where you start to have just these really strong ideologies versus a philosophy that says, hey, in general, don't hurt people and do things that have a good outcome versus a bad outcome.
Do you think that might have, and this is an open question, I genuinely have no idea to the answer to this. Do you think that may already be happening in humanism? Do you think that there are already little groups which have these core set of values, and these which have slightly different ones, and these that have slightly different ones, while all coming under the umbrella term humanist?
I mean, I don't know much in terms of facts to answer that question, so I'm going to just make up some things.
Yes.
But
like a good skeptic, we're now going to make up facts, just so you guys all know.
But like I think because any sort of group of people that becomes a codified like organization that has to have rules and whatever else. I've said Humanist UK a lot, but there are loads of other humanist groups. But that's a national organization in the UK that has rules of membership. It has guidelines that people have to abide by and all those sorts of things. And I'm not saying necessarily that I disagree with any of them, but I think whenever you've got a group of people that is codified in a formal organization like that, you will inevitably have differences, won't you? And I don't think that necessarily means that the people themselves necessarily believe strongly differently here or there or what have you. But, does Humanist Scotland have, slightly different views in one way compared to Humanist UK? Or, I think more possibly just slightly different priorities, isn't it? Humanist UK lobbies for loads of things to do with secular ideals and whatever else. It lobbies for the right of, in England and Wales, for example, there's humanist weddings are not legal forms of marriage. You cannot be married in a humanist ceremony in England and Wales, but you can in Scotland. So Humanist UK
it's like
lobbies for that in England. It's priorities in terms of the needs of the people that those organizations see.
I had no idea about that.
Yeah, and I think it's somewhat the same in the United States, although I know less about the different organizations. But that is kind of what turned me off, is when I started researching it. Like when I researched it from a philosophical perspective, I was like, oh yeah, other than the idea of us not having my two biggest complaints about the philosophy was that it doesn't protect like things that aren't human, and that it doesn't stop us from exploitation in order to gain those means. Like if it's an overall good, what's stopping us from the exploitation either of our environment or other people, right? So
but likewise you can that's the whole thing about it not being like a really authoritative, like strict, like doctrinal thing, because like I call myself humanist, but I'm not a member of any of these humanist organizations,
right.
And then there's nothing stopping me from just adding on a desire to care for the environment, a desire to care for the welfare of animals, like
it's not limiting is what you're saying. Like some religions are very limiting, like you will only worship one God, or these are the rules, this is how you will wash for prayers or whatever. You're right. Like it's very prescribed, versus this is more of a lifestyle choice, or like
a starting point and a jumping off point.
Yeah. What one of the interesting things you said about the organizations, though, that I wanted to say is that like you do start to see, because Gilliver had asked earlier about whether or not
Whichever
it's opposed, whether or not it's opposed to religion, and that is where I was like, ooh, that's where you see it, is with these organizations. So you may not see it with individual humanists, but these organizations, everyone that I researched, and one of the things that turned me off the most from calling myself a humanist by ideology versus philosophy was I don't want to associate with organizations that their sole cause is just to eradicate religion or fight against religion. And those things are important, and I want to put money and I want to put volunteer work and all other stuff forward, getting prayer out of schools and stuff like that I feel strongly about. But I don't want to be a part of an ideology that it seems like the main purpose is like they're all just constantly battling each other for dominance, and that to me was very, very off-putting.
Yeah, so we're getting we're gonna have a quick commercial break. When we come back, I want to know if activism is a necessary part of humanism.
Oh, good question. All right, off to commercials.
Okay, so what have we got coming up this week? Well,
I've got naff all. I've got naff all coming up this week.
Oh, I've got a full schedule, babies, but nothing online.
Well, I think we're all kind of busy in as personal lives at the minute. It's coming to that time, isn't it, where we're getting to the end of lockdown and everybody's kind of filling the schedules up trying to get back to a like pre-lockdown normal life.
Yep, our heads are spinning as we mix the lockdown lifestyles that we've all created with our back to regular lifestyles, and like the two are now colliding.
Yeah, it's becoming an interesting time. We're going to have to see how this pans out.
Yeah.
I tend to think that we're going to see a bit of a rise in post-traumatic stress occurring. I've just got a feeling that might happen. There might be a lot more medical referrals to that. Aside from that,
suddenly went a bit dark. Let's move on.
This is a commercial break. This is not a whole new episode.
I'm on the perspective with a wonderful friend of our show, Ethan Michael, on the 6th of June. It's so much fun being on there. I can't wait to do that. And that's
tell me you mean the 6th of July. Because because if you're on the 6th of June, you missed that bit already.
I've got the dates completely wrong. So I'm on the 6th of July. That's correct. I will have to change all my notes for upcoming things in future now because I've got that completely wrong. Yeah, 6th of July. I'm on the perspective. Ethan's brilliant. We've talked about Ethan before on the show. You've probably seen me and Laura do stuff with him before. He's a great facility for people like us. He's got such a good network TV programs that they're
very enthusiastic grower of communities. Yeah, so I like it.
Definitely, is really good. Next week on our show, we've got a very special guest, but I'm going to keep a secret just for a little bit longer. But the show is about creationism, so let your minds run wild with who
it will
that
be
might
good.
be.
It's God.
Is it Ken Ham or is it Kent Hovind? It's God. That'd be awesome.
It's God.
That would put that story or that question.
We have actual God on the show.
Not even shitting you guys. No, but so look out for that announcement. Uh-oh, did we lose Gil?
No.
Oh, you looked frozen.
It was just very still.
I'm just very still, peaceful.
So, Gil, Facebook. I heard there's some places you can go to hang out there.
Sorry. This is why there's an awkward pause because I'm not picking up on your cues for me being my time.
It just makes the commercials more interesting.
So this is the bit where I'm unrealistically enthusiastic about a Facebook group that actually does deserve an unrealistic level of enthusiasm. So our Facebook group is wonderful, and I am just.
That's not unrealistic.
It's no okay. The Facebook group is great. Everyone should go and join it, and you can find the link to that at linktr.ee/skeptic hangout. It's a great place for conversation, discussions, and most recently, people in that group have had their say and voted on the topic of this very episode. So that was a brilliant way that we got some sort of audience participation in what we're doing. So yeah, if you haven't already joined, please do so. We will welcome you with open arms, social distance in a COVID-loving way.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Now back to the show. So we'll catch you in just a minute.
Okay, so before the commercial break, I asked the question, do you think that humanism necessarily needs activism in order to function? So let's go with Gil.
No.
Is that no, you don't want to go or no?
No, I'm not answering that question.
I refuse. Don't know why you keep asking.
Don't tell me what to do.
No, I mean, because I think activism has a really important role to play. But actually, I think, like what I was saying before, humanist to me just sort of describes the way I think about things. If I then decide that the way I think about things emboldens me and sort of inspires me to engage in activism because I see in fairness, injustice, or something that's, promoting inequality or prejudice, then fair dues. But I think, and that's why I think there is a big and really important role for these formal organizations to play, because it's a way of humanists getting together and actually doing something in sort of coordination with one another, as opposed to me just sitting in my house being a humanist happily on my own, not having any way to necessarily organize in that sort of way to effect change in a big sort of Where?
Yeah, so I would say I agree a lot with what you say, but in answer to the question, I would say it's a yes and a no, because what is your end goal? Like what is the end goal of humanism in general, right? If
Does there need
it's
to be one?
what's that?
Does there need to be one?
No, not necessarily, but that would be the answer to the question about whether or not we need activism. Well, if there's an end goal to humanism,
Yeah.
then yeah, you might need activism in order to get the word out. Or if it's a philosophy that wants to grow the way that, say, Christianity wants to grow, where it's like go out and make other people follow this religion, right? Then yes, activism is like critical for getting out there. But I like Gil's take, where it's like, well, hold on a second. Is it that activism is necessary to grow humanism, or is it that humanism is a good means for growing activism? Right.
Yeah, and I think as well no, hang on. I had a thought and then it went. What did you say before that? Before you agreed with how amazing my point was?
I said that yes, it is necessary if it has an end game, like where it wants to
Okay,
grow or
yeah.
it wants to accomplish something.
Oh, the thing about growing is interesting. So, because I think a big push by humanist organisations, at least in the UK, is trying to say to people, look, you actually are a humanist and you don't really know it. And I think that's an interesting thing to discuss with you two. And it does touch on the labels thing, but it's relevant to humanism. Like a lot of people who I know who are not religious, if you asked them, do you think science is probably the best way of finding out about the world around us in the universe? They'd probably say yes. If you said, do you think we should base what's good and bad things to do based on whether or not it affects human well-being positively or negatively, they're probably like, yeah. Do you reckon there's an afterlife? Probably no. You know, and like all those sorts of descriptions
Right.
probably mostly apply to most non-religious people. And so lots of humanists do try and proselytize in a way, but not in terms of to try and convert people to that way of thinking, but just to enable people to see maybe this is a label that does apply to me.
Is that
And
more
I'm
like educating though? Is that more like just letting people know what humanism is
But then,
versus
likewise, you two both agreed with most of those definitions, but
right?
don't want to attach that label to yourself.
Well, and I've heard of people that don't want to be called atheist even though they don't believe in God. And so I
Yeah.
think really there's power to a label, and sometimes that power can be good or negative. And again, I need to save this for a different episode. But when it comes to the humanist label, I think where I can see a benefit to that is in getting people to understand what their views are, and where it fits into the grander scheme of other philosophies and stuff. Like, well, if you think this and this philosophy is like, it covers those beliefs, right? Like you could be a
Yeah.
naturalist just because you believe what the naturalists believe, not because you call yourself a naturalist. You happen to fit that label based on
Yeah.
what you believe.
And I think a lot of the time, especially like with the recent UK census, which we don't know any data from, but like censuses in the UK have a religion box which says, are you Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, whatever, or non-religious? And I think a lot of the people in the UK tick Christian by default because they either went to a church school or the parents used to be Catholics, or, you know, like there's all that latent background default Christianity-ness going on that we've talked about before. And part of that whole thing about like people are humanists and don't realize it is it kind of is a rallying point for people to be like, actually, no, I am this, instead of just like maybe probably Christian or maybe kind of not religious. It is that sort of, oh, maybe I am this. And that matters physically in the real world, because if government or local authority policy is based on the fact that they know they've got 60% of the people there are Christians,
Right.
well, they're going to cater for 60% of the population being Christians, as opposed to the reality, which is far different to that statistic.
Yeah, that's a
I'm
good point.
torn on this. I'm torn, and I'm torn because maybe because of my prejudice towards being labeled something. But I kind of agree that if you kind of tick all the boxes, you are that thing, whether you label yourself it or not.
Yeah.
But by the same token, kind of how you introduced this kind of section was by saying that the humanists had kind of said, well, you are a humanist, whether you think you are or not. That's very kind of, you know, well, you believe in God, whether you think you do or you don't.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And
Which is why I
that,
wanted to talk about it, because I think it's a really interesting idea in terms of, yeah, it might describe people accurately, but if people don't want to be described in that way, like you said, Laura, about like people who are atheists who don't want to, you know, people are much more comfortable calling themselves agnostics or just undecided or on the fence, as opposed to atheist, even though that accurately describes what they are.
Or
Label.
spiritual. People love just saying, oh no, I'm just spiritual. Like, I don't want to call myself Christian, don't want to call myself atheist.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Did your mod say over?
Yeah.
that?
So in terms
You're not
of
Jover.
oh no.
No, go on, Laura. Go on.
Oh no, I was just gonna say in terms of the label and the discomfort that people feel, I think a lot of times it is because we tend to put a lot of baggage into our labels. And so I think that when it comes to humanism, yes, the more that people get educated on what it is and the more that it's out there, the more they can choose, like they can look into and determine, oh, hey, this is something that I belong to. But it kind of sounds a lot like almost like loading, like, oh, we have this many members or this many people are this without them actually identifying as such. It kind of sounds like what would you call it? Like loading the numbers, like puffing up the numbers. But really what slows people down and what slows me down is the idea of, okay, well, you say humanism is X, Y, and Z, and that I'm X, Y, and Z. But what about everything else that goes along with it? What about all the other ideas or like what you said, like maybe activism with government regulation and stuff? And is that something I want to label myself and associate with? Or is that something I believe in? So yeah, I do see that like the idea of labeling somebody else anything can be problematic.
Yeah, when we're talking about kind of labels as well, without going too much into that newly formed episode, I've very often, and I don't know whether you two have come across this as well. Very often, when I've come across humanism, not in every case, but in many cases, it's been by people who also consider themselves Satanists who use the term. They kind of use it to distinguish themselves from maybe these branches of Satanists who have supernatural beliefs. They because then I think it's more prevalent in the US, but there's
like
certain
the
groups.
Temple. Yeah,
there's certain groups that will say, we have no supernatural claims. We are humanists. And they kind of, that forms a large part of their identity. So what are your thoughts on that?
I suddenly realized I don't think I have many. I think it's hard because, and again with the labels thing, like it just depends how much value you give to that label, and in terms of like, is it just a descriptor or is it your identity? And it's like I have an incredible number of labels that I assign myself, and if anyone's read my Facebook bio, you'll see all it is a list of labels. I'm a Ravenclaw, I'm a linguist, I'm a teacher, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm all these sorts of things. But for me, all of them just describe tiny bits of things which make up who I am generally as a person. Yeah, I think the thing you said about Satanist possibly is a lot more relevant to American stuff than in the UK.
Pressure's on you, Laura.
Stuff. Yeah. So I do see the link, especially like with the Satanic Temple working alongside the Humanist Association and stuff. Like they do have some differences. And I know that the Satanic Temple, for example, does have tenets that they adhere to. But I think it can work for or against any organization, right? So adding the label humanist or having a satanic type organization attach the label humanist to themselves can work to their advantage in the sense of getting it out there that like, hey, we are about taking care of people. We're not about like sex, drugs, rock and roll, and Satan worship and sacrificing babies and killing things and seances. Like that's not us, right?
Oh, I'm not joining them. This sounds boring.
Right, I know it's not nearly as fun as I thought. I mean, the first meeting was kind of no, but anyway, the thing is, it can also work against you because when people hear the idea of satanic beliefs being associated with humanist beliefs, now you have this sort of tug and pull from the non-secular community of, see, I told you that's bad, or these associations where it's like, oh, you want to call yourself a humanist, but Satanists are also humanists too. So it's sort of, it has this like back and forth pro and con to it where they could work to help support each other, to help educate people and to help get people desensitized to some of these ideas. At the same time, it could just put up more walls and make it more difficult for people to really know what it is that either organization is really about.
Yeah. What is the presence of kind of, I don't want to go off humanism here, but what is the kind of presence of the satanic stuff in the US? Because I know when we had our friend Jenna Belcon, she touched upon it briefly. And I was just wondering if it's because over here, it's like nobody ever
Yeah,
mentions
I don't know.
satanic
Yeah,
stuff at all.
I'm not even in the news.
But then is it just
often
because of
enough.
our sort of echo chamber that we live in online as people in this sort of realm of religion and all those sorts of, do we just hear about it more because of the connections we have online?
I kind of assume that because the only context in which I've heard about a lot of this stuff is the context of the conversations between atheism and religion and stuff like that. Like that's where I learned about the Satanic Temple and a lot of their actions alongside like Freedom from Religion Foundation and those places, like the work that they're doing. The only reason I know about that kind of stuff is because I'm actively going out and trying to seek that knowledge and learn about it. So in terms of whether or not it's a big trend or whether or not it's growing, I mean, I know their numbers are growing, but whether it's significant or not, I honestly don't know. I don't hear a lot about it mainstream. And when you do, it's the typical back and forth, like, no, it's not as bad as you think. And oh yeah, totally it is, So
So are you trying to tell me that you've never tried playing your Motley Crue record backwards? Is that what you're saying?
I have never had a Motley Crue record to play backwards.
I remember as a teenager playing Stairway to Heaven backwards, and I absolutely could hear all of those lyrics, and saying was entering my soul, and it was terrifying.
Oh my Lord. But then I wonder, like, not to get too far off topic of the humanism thing, but then I do wonder, like, if we come up with a really clever list of different lyrics that sound similar to, if you could be equally convinced. I suspect you can be.
No, it was Satan.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yep. And he's still in your heart, clearly, because you don't love. All right, this is going way far away from humanism. So let's bring it back.
Right, humanism. One thing that I think is interesting about humanism, and I touched on it before in terms of humanist weddings in England and Wales not being legally recognised, but like rites of passage is a big deal where lots of, if you're part of a religion, all the rites of passage in your life have that sort of religious aspect to them. So like when a child is, like say for like the average British kid in, an English town, they'll be born, probably by default, they'll get baptized as an infant in the local church. That's a rite of passage. It's almost like the big celebration of the baby being born is the baptism party. And actually, since not being a Christian, I've had 2 of my children baptized in the Church of England because that seemed like the default rite of passage to happen. Whereas like humanists often promote things like naming ceremonies, which is a similar sort of occasion where it's like celebrating the birth of the child, but it goes around, thinking about the meaning of the name of the child and celebrating that child, as opposed to it being about entering.
And you talked about things like humanist weddings and stuff. So do you think that having some of those social traditions and rituals and practices is kind of inherent to when we build an organization or a worldview or an ideology? It kind of seems to go like, really, the two aren't related at all. What I think about eternity and what I think about like my morals and what I should do day to day has nothing to do with a ceremony like for naming a child or getting married, right? But we tend to kind of link the two together so much so that to have an organization that doesn't focus on God or a religious belief system, it still focuses on all of these social practices that seem to be really like tightly woven in.
Yeah.
It's almost like it has to in order to survive.
Yeah, and rites of passage are incredibly important for us, like emotionally and socially and stuff. We want to celebrate the birth of a child, but there has to be a reason why we're just celebrating the birth of a child. And whether that is a baptism or a naming ceremony or something like that, we feel the need to celebrate those important milestones, don't we?
Right.
And I think a lot of people who don't know much about it probably, and I kind of did before I really looked into it too much, kind of assumed humanist weddings or humanist funerals or humanist naming ceremonies or all these sorts of things were a bit sort of namby-pamby, hippie, doodah, whatnot. But like, actually, a lot of it is just, we need to celebrate something, and this is a framework around which we can build our own celebration. And again, with all those things, it's not this is how you do a naming ceremony or this is how you do a humanist wedding, because it's just a way of describing a way of doing it which isn't religious and specifically does focus on what it's actually about rather than other factors that are involved outside.
Having said that, I've been to a humanist funeral and it was the most boring funeral I've ever been to.
Oh, really?
It was just completely like devoid of any emotion whatsoever. It was really, I found it uncomfortable.
But do you think that's the result of it being humanist or the result of the planners and the people who put it together? Like that could be a personality.
Oh thing. Yeah. I think it's. I don't think it's because it was a humanist funeral, but that's my only.
But it kind of just I was gonna say I put on a humanist funeral for my grandmother, and I officiated it and made the scripts and all that stuff. And I worked in one prayer for the people who wanted prayers, right? Like, and I had somebody else do it and offer it. And we had fun. We had music playing and like shared poems, and everyone cried, and it was really emotional. But yeah, it is very interesting how an experience like that, it's almost like when you go to a restaurant, you have like that one bad meal, you don't want to go back, even if it was like a fluke.
Maybe as well, that's another a point where we're like talking about Satanism and labels. It being, maybe that's one of the negatives to having a label put on something, because if you've got someone, I mean, I'm quite open-minded and fair, and I'm not going to attribute all humanist funerals as really drab and boring.
But it's really reasonable to have that that preconception. You've had that experience of it, and so you kind of like, oh, is that what they like? All right, okay.
Oh, we're gonna go to another one.
I think.
Yeah. What do you think? I know we touched upon it, and we all said we had no idea what they were about. So this might be a bit of a difficult question, but in terms of religious people consider themselves humanists.
Oh yeah.
Not what, I'm not going to ask you what you think they believe, because we've all said we don't know that. I'm interested in if you think that that's a possibility, that you can be religious but still put emphasis on human relationships, and without that religious aspect entering into that, and now you relate to other people and move forward politically and stuff. Can you have that while still being religious?
Yes.
So I'm thinking about the list of things that I sort of traipsed off at the beginning, and a lot of them are kind of, when you think about it, to do with religious ideas. So, I explained how, like, I don't look to religious authority or holy books to get ideas about morality. I think about human welfare and well-being. Well, as a religious person, you can also do that, can't you? Like, you don't just get your ideas about morality from your religion and the people and the text in that religion. You also think, mostly day to day, about, is this the right thing to do because would I like that done to me? Or, and it's not, I don't think it's black and white, is it? So actually there are lots of things about humanism. When I was a Christian, I still believed that Big Bang cosmology was the best way to understand how the universe worked. How the universe sort of came about, to the best of our knowledge, the limited sort of understanding that I had. I just thought God did it. So, like, there are things where, like, science actually did explain all those things, but the point at which we then didn't understand and science can't explain, obviously that's when God sort of snuck in there, God of the gaps, and that's a whole separate conversation. Yeah. But I think lots of the things, you can take most of that and apply it to everything, and lots of people can think very sort of, maybe mistakenly, but I'm thinking rationally about these things. So rational tick, that's one of those. Yeah, I think a lot of it can apply to religious people. Calling yourself a religious humanist, I think, is an interesting label to give yourself, though, because I think, are you saying then that your religion doesn't have enough and you need more? Like, I'm not just a Christian, I'm also a humanist. Like, are you saying there's a lack in Christianity of something that you need to make up for? Or
I think that the context in which I've heard that is more like, organized religion doesn't necessarily represent my views, but I'm still religious. So I've heard Christian humanists specifically, where they're like, well, people say that God says this, this, and this, but I don't personally believe that God has anything to say, for example, about, say, LGBTQ issues, or about slavery, or about this, or about that. So from what I've seen, it's more of a, no, I still believe the Bible, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, but I believe that that the church or the organization is too structured and too, like, the way that they're saying this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. That is where I separate from that Christian label and attach or add on the humanist label, where it's like, well, my morality has a little bit more to do with reflecting on human flourishing, whereas maybe the morality of my church or the organization is more like, well, the Bible says, therefore you better do this.
Yeah.
So I guess it goes along with the disillusionment that we talk a lot about, like with especially on the nonprofits, for example. There's lots of articles about people leaving the Christian church or switching churches or whatever because of that disillusionment. Like,
I was literally going to mention the nonprofits in exactly that, because in one of the recent episodes they were actually talking about the Southern Baptist Church and how people were kind of leaving that in droves at the minute because of the views on certain subjects and how they handled certain situations. So go and watch the nonprofits.
Yeah, and it could be political too. Like, it could be that, well, in terms of my own personal values and my own personal lifestyle, I'm a Christian, but in terms of, like, whether or not someone can get an abortion, or what we do with taxes, or whether or not we should own guns and stuff, that comes more from my own personal ideologies and less from my religion. And so as a humanist, I might diverge from what the overall Christian sort of belief system is politically, right? Like you have overwhelming numbers of religious people who believe this politically or believe that politically, but really it has
It's like
very little to do with their
Christianity
religion.
or that religious label being a thing to how you live your own life,
Right.
but you believe in that humanist ideal for society as a whole,
For other
where
people,
then have the freedom of things. And obviously that links loads with secularism and the things we talked about, certainly in that regard, with Jenna Belk, which you should check out and subscribe and all that.
Okay. So do we want to, and I can cut this out, but do we want to keep this going a little bit longer, or do we want to call it quits? Because it'll be a little bit over an hour one way or another, but we haven't hit that 10-minute mark yet. So
I don't have anything else to say.
Okay, so I'll cut this part out, but let's sort of wrap it up then. So yeah, I don't really have a way of wrapping it up. I just know that we hit a lull. I wanted to throw that out.
I'll start the wrapping up then. Yes, I think humanism is a really interesting thing to think about, and obviously neither of you had sort of, I guess, strong opinions or knowledge about it to begin with at the beginning of the conversation. And I think with all labels, it has the power to be an incredibly effective descriptor. But I think we've talked quite clearly about the limitations of stuff like that, and specifically with humanism, in terms of the sort of role that it can play. So yeah, sort of to finish off, have either of you been convinced by the humanist label during this conversation?
I think it has usefulness here and there depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I think I think if someone were to ask me, like, how would you approach a specific issue? Would you, like, ideologically, I would say, well, I might take a more humanist view of this perspective or of this particular issue. But I'm really reluctant still to adopt, and like, even if I became convinced, for example, of a different religion, like Buddhism or Hinduism or something that's a little bit more exotic from my experience, I think I'd still be reluctant to say I am this just because I agree with a lot of what it has to say, or it speaks to me, you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty much the same as before we started. As far as my stance goes, it's not a label I'd use. I think it's very interesting I think I need to learn more about it. And I love these episodes. These are apps. I said to Richard before we recorded that I absolutely love these episodes where I don't know anything about the stuff, because I love just sitting and like, you know, chewing the fat and trying to get a better understanding of things. And it's if you are a member of our group, our Facebook discussion group, and you're watching this, and you are a humanist, or you consider yourself a humanist, or you have ideas about humanism, or you think you can give us some more information, please give it us. You know, we're all about learning more about things. That's exactly what we want to do. So,
and I think I'd be interested as well, you know, when I was saying before about lots of people don't really even know that much about the label, or maybe would consider themselves humanists if they, you know, if they knew more about it or whatever. Maybe if some people, you know, through the conversation, maybe thinking, actually, maybe that does describe me. I'd be very interested to hear like people's thoughts on that, on that regard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you kind of follow the same belief system, but choose not to identify yourself as humanist, basically just anything that forwards or furthers the discussion would be really interesting to hear about.
Anything.
Literally, just tell us anything, people. Talk to us. Yeah, but in the meantime, thank you guys so much for joining us. This conversation was actually really a lot more intriguing than I thought it would be, because I didn't know what we would have to say on the issue, and so this has been really, really pleasant, and it's definitely pushed the limits of my ability to converse about things that I don't know about. So I will leave you all with that, and in the meantime, we are Laura,
Richard,
and this has been Skeptic Hangout. Until next time,
keep questioning,
interrogate your beliefs,
and stay skeptical.
Bye all.
Hurrah!